Rob has served in pastoral ministry for over 38 years, including 20 years as senior pastor of Furlong Church of Christ, before transitioning to a role as pastoral consultant with the Baptist churches for 2.5 years. In 2017, Rob returned to local ministry as the senior pastor at Woodvale Baptist Church and is enjoying building a life with the local congregation there. Rob has either led or been a member of several short-term mission teams that saw him travel to Vietnam, Thailand, India and Zimbabwe, and I know that he recently also went to Israel and had a wonderful trip there. He's also had extensive experience in teaching, training and preaching to leaders and church members to better equip them for ministry they've been called to. He loves to see the local church grow spiritually initially and to expand its impact locally and overseas. Rob and his wife Karen also have a strong desire to encourage God's people to grow holistically in every area of their lives, spiritually, physically, mentally and emotionally. To that end, they're both committed to growing in loving both God and people well and assisting others to do the same. Rob has been married to Karen for over 40 years and they've been blessed with 4 adult children and get this, 16 grandchildren. He's chaplain to the Western Australian and Scorchers cricket teams for 16 seasons, supports the Fremantle Dockers but don't hold that against him, enjoys reading, bike riding with Karen and is a budding master chef. And personally speaking, Rob is a wonderful friend of mine and it gives me a great pleasure to introduce you to him, so welcome Rob, thank you.
Well, good afternoon. The only comment I'll make on the football tonight is the future is purple. So I've been asked to speak to you this afternoon on crucial conversations. I don't know, we've probably got some English teachers here. One of my favourite books, which I a few years back read to my granddaughters, is Winnie the Pooh. You may remember the famous story of Winnie the Pooh. The most famous one is when he goes and has afternoon tea with Rabbit, and at the end of the afternoon, he tries to leave through the front entrance of Rabbit's warren and gets stuck because he's eaten so much. And as the story goes on, Rabbit comes to a point where he actually wants to get out of his rabbit warren to go and do some errands, and he discovers that he can't leave by the front entrance because Winnie the Pooh is stuck there. So he goes around the back entrance, comes around to the front, and says to Pooh, "Hello, are you stuck?" he asked. "No," said Pooh carelessly, "just resting and thinking and humming to myself." "The fact is," said Rabbit, "you're stuck." "It all comes," said Pooh crossly, "of not having one's front door big enough." To which Rabbit responds, "It all comes of eating too much." "I thought at the time," said Rabbit, "only I didn't like to say anything," said Rabbit, "that one of us is eating too much," said Rabbit, "and I know it wasn't me." Have you ever had a conversation like that? Where there is a truth, there is an elephant in the room, or in this case there is a bear stuck in the front entrance, and we all know what the problem is, but everybody dances around it. Welcome to the world of crucial conversations. And I'll refer back to that story a little bit later on, but we're going to have that discussion this afternoon around this topic of crucial conversations because it's vitally important. My experience, as Ray mentioned, I've been in pastoral ministry for quite some time. My experience has been this, that as Christians we understand the importance of conversations, particularly when relationships might not be going so well. And so because we're Christians, because we're committed to God's word, we understand that these are important things to have and to do. But my experience has been that in the life of the church, we actually don't give people the tools and the skills to be able to have that conversation. We talk a lot about this is what you should do, and then we go away and we feel guilty because we wrestle with the idea of should I have this conversation or not. But then the deeper question is, how do I go about it? what do I do? So what I'm sharing with you this afternoon comes out of my experience as a Christian and as a pastor over many years. And I'm hopeful that along the way we'll be able to, or I'll be able to help you in terms of where we're going with all of this and to do these things better. But conversations are a part of life, and it's important to remember that when it comes to conversations, we have them about all sorts of things. We talk about the footy might be the latest book we're reading or the latest film that we've seen. But the other thing is that it's important to know that in conversations, not only do we talk to people, but we talk about people, don't we? Now, as soon as you hear in a Christian context that we talk about people, we immediately think of we should never talk about people. But that's not true. We have all sorts of conversations about people, about what they're doing, about something they might have attended, and we immediately go to this idea of gossip. But we talk about people all the time. There's a good place about that, but then there is, of course, the negative side, and that's when we're talking about people for the wrong reasons and about the wrong things and with the wrong motivations. So what we want to try to do this afternoon is to get past that so that we can actually do these things better. So, as I said, this afternoon is called Crucial Conversations. And I thought where we would begin is let's talk briefly about barriers to crucial conversations. What are the things that get in the way of having these conversations? Because there are a number of things. The first one is fear. Now, when I talk about fear, the reason why I mention that and put it at the top is because this is the most likely reason why we won't have a crucial conversation with someone. We know that we need to have this conversation, but we are afraid. And there are all sorts of reasons why we might be afraid, but the chief one is that we are afraid of conflict. We're afraid about how the person might react. True, isn't it? We're afraid that they might blow up. We're afraid that the conversation might get turned back on us. And so we seek to avoid the conversation. Now, this is a subject for another time, but at this point, when we are dealing with the fear of conflict, there's just a few things I want to say to you. The first is that everybody, to greater or lesser degrees, but everybody struggles with conflict, okay? Some of us are more prone to wanting to avoid conflict. Some of us have a tendency to fly right into conflict, but every one of us struggles with conflict. And at some level, we are afraid of conflict. And we have different ways of coping with that. As I said, this would be a subject for another time. But it's important to actually get to know your conflict style. A very helpful thing I came across many years ago was a grid called the conflict grid. And these guys had borrowed it from psychology, but they put it into the context of the Christian faith and came up with a Christian model for dealing with conflict. But they go through the various ways in which people use conflict. Now, just up front so that you know, my natural tendency to deal with conflict is to avoid it. That's the truth. I'll share a little bit about how I've grown through that. But I grew up in a family where conflict was solved by my parents yelling at us, and their word was the gospel, that was it, their way or the highway, and that's how conflict was dealt with. You weren't given the opportunity. So what you did was you learned in that to avoid conflict, to dance around it, and also to keep the peace. So some of us fall into that category, others of us charge headlong into it. But in understanding conflict, it's good to understand your own style and to learn what or how you respond in these conflict situations. Now, I say that from the perspective of we all struggle with conflict, but here's the thing, you don't have to be afraid of it. And when I say that to you this afternoon, I'm saying it to myself. I have to remind myself repeatedly, you don't have to be afraid of conflict, because good things come out of conflict. Good things emerge. It gets dark and it gets scary at times, but good things come out of it. But fear is a reason that, or is one of the barriers to a crucial conversation. Another one is anger. Now, there are two types of anger. There is aggressive anger and passive anger. We're all familiar with aggressive anger, aren't we? That's where the person just blows up. And often the reason the person blows up is because you may have struck a nerve, and so their reason for blowing up is to actually deflect it away, and they're sending out a message that says, I don't want to discuss this, how dare you do that, and so we close up. and that becomes a barrier to having that important conversation. The other is a little more subtle, but it's equally as deadly, and that's passive anger, and that's where the person closes down on you. Ever had that? You've tried to raise an issue, and the person just closes down, they won't talk about it, and then the next step along is they freeze you out. None of us do that, do we? But that becomes a barrier to a crucial conversation. The next barrier is defensiveness. This is where you try to have the conversation with the person, but they become extremely defensive. I'll give you a good example. So Ray mentioned that I was involved in a church, local church, Thornley, for 20 years, and part of the structure of our ministry was a school, so I'm familiar with the dynamics to some degree of Christian schools and teachers and all the things that we face. I remember having, and if you don't think that this is easy, when you're the pastor of the church and the school is a part of your ministry, it's not easy when you have to go and sit down with a teacher and ask them why they treated your child in a certain way. That's just a fact of life. But I had this conversation because my youngest son was being ignored on a particular issue in class, and he'd come 2 or 3 days into the class to actually, it was basically a show and tell thing, but every time it was his turn, he was ignored. And this had happened repeatedly. He was getting quite discouraged. So I went down and sat down with the teacher and explained to her why I was there. I did this carefully, but just laid it out. This is what's happening. And can you tell me why this is happening? Why is he not being given an opportunity? And the immediate response I got from the person was, "You've come in here making all these accusations against me, and I don't like the way you're looking at me." Incredibly defensive. At that point, I'm just being honest with you, I wanted to say, let's stick to the facts, shall we? Yeah, come out with some smart, sarcastic response. I can't remember how I responded, but the fact of the matter is that defensiveness in those situations will close the conversation down, because if the person comes back and wants to defend their territory and not even begin to give half an ear to what you're saying, it becomes a barrier to the conversation. The next one is dishonesty and evasiveness. Have you ever had a conversation with someone, you've raised an issue, and let's just say in this particular issue, you know the truth of the matter. Okay, but you raise it with the person, you don't make an accusation, but you raise the issue. And people handle this in a number of ways. So I'm thinking here of some colleagues that I worked with, and there were some things that I had to raise with them separately on different occasions. And I would get responses like this. I would put forward the question, okay, can you explain this to me, please? So it's done in a gracious way. And I get this response. The subject is changed immediately. Have you ever had that happen? You ask a question, you're trying to find out what the truth of the matter is, and the person completely changes the subject. So I can be a pretty annoying person, so I come back to the question, and I'll ask the question a second time. And then what happens is it's completely ignored. There's no response. So I come back to the question a third time, and then the third time, the person one of these people turned it back on me. Have you ever had that? It's evasiveness. And when people start to evade, you know, perhaps they're not seeking to be outright dishonest. Sometimes people will lie in these conversations, but these become barriers. When people are trying to evade the question or evade the issue, it becomes a barrier to having an honest conversation with the person. And at some point, you're probably going to have to give the conversation up at that moment, simply because you're not going to get anywhere. But it's a barrier nonetheless. The next one is assuming. By assuming, what I'm talking about here is this gets into the area of expectations. Now, I have a friend who's dealt a lot with conflict in churches, and so that involves a lot of crucial conversations when you're trying to sort out some of the messes that churches get themselves into. But in this area of assuming, he says that all conflict is the result of unmet expectations. Now, I'm not so sure about that. I think a lot of conflict is, but I don't think that it's exclusively that. However, what happens with expectations is that we make assumptions, and it leads to problems, and it can lead to barriers in conversations and in communication. Let me say this briefly about expectations. Expectations are usually unconscious, unexpressed, unrealistic, and unagreed upon. And what do I mean? Most often when a person doesn't meet an expectation for us in a relationship, it's because we might have had the expectation, but the other person did. Do you understand what I'm saying? Ever had that? You were expecting something, the other person didn't. That's an unconscious expectation. Sometimes it's an unrealistic expectation. It could be a wife saying to her husband, I believe you're going to meet every single need that I have in my life for all of my life. Is that a realistic expectation? Some of you think it is, okay. I'll make an assumption there, we can talk later. So, an expectation has to be conscious. Both people have to be aware of it. It has to be realistic. As I said, often they're unspoken. In other words, the expectation hasn't been expressed to the other person. My father was great at this. We would find out that we had not met an expectation that he had because he wouldn't talk to us for 2 or 3 days. We had no idea what it was we'd done wrong or what the expectation was that we had messed up. But when he started to close up and not talk to us, that's when we knew that we'd done something wrong. Now, that's not a healthy way to conduct relationships with anybody, even with parents and kids. So expectations have to be clearly spoken and they have to be agreed upon. In other words, as you've talked it through, if you both don't agree on it or come to an agreement, it can't be a valid expectation. So that's just something to think about. But assuming, so in a conversation, we have to be careful we don't make assumptions based on faulty expectations. They have to be talked through. Hint dropping is another barrier to a crucial conversation. The best example I can give you of this is my wife's grandmother. And she said to me one day, I can't remember what it was I hadn't done, but I clearly got the hint that I hadn't done something because she said, you can go off people, you know. So, what was the message? You haven't done what I wanted you to do or expected you to do, and if you don't measure up, so she's dropping a hint, you can go off people, you know. Hint dropping never helps in whole or holistic and open conversations. Denial. This is, if you see the background, can you see the background picture, husband and wife? Now, can you see the nail sticking out of her head? Can you see that? I don't know if, when you go home, get onto YouTube and Google, onto YouTube and do the search, put into the search engine, it's not about the nail. You'll love it because this is a husband and wife and she starts off the conversation, you can't see it, but she starts off the conversation by saying, I've got this horrible headache and it's been driving me nuts for weeks and I can't seem to get it out of my head. And then she turns around and she's got this nail sticking in her head. And the husband says, I think it's because you've got a nail in your head. And she goes, stop trying to fix my problem. I just want you to listen. It's a classic case of denial. Go home, YouTube, it's not about the nail, have a look at it. It's even funnier than when you look at it, it's just hilarious about how this guy tries to deal with it. But when you raise an issue with a person and they go into denial, it's very limiting in terms of how far you're going to get into that conversation. That's exactly what you have in the Winnie the Pooh scenario. You've got denial and hint dropping. On the one hand, Winnie is denying the fact that he's eaten too much at the afternoon tea, and that's why he's stuck in the entranceway to Rabbit's Warren. But equally so, when the issue is sort of broached, Rabbit starts dropping hints, and it's along the lines of, well, I know someone was eating too much and it wasn't me, but he doesn't have the courage to come out and say that it was actually Winnie. So again, a conversation, or a crucial conversation, becomes very difficult to have. Let me talk about trust. Now, I know that the issue of conversations and trust has been discussed here recently, and what was underlined was the importance of trust. But I actually want to push into that a little bit because trust can actually be misapplied as well. For example, some people can use the issue of trust to say, okay, they see a situation, they're aware of something that's going on, and they won't have the conversation because they say, well, there's no trust between us. I don't have the confidence of that person, they don't have my confidence. Sometimes you are going to be placed into a situation where you need to step into it. Somebody needs to step into the situation. And you can't always wait around for complete and utter trust to be built. The other issue is, take a relationship that has been completely broken down, where there's been angry words said and the people are in broken relationship. The trust has been broken, folks. And the only way the trust will be rebuilt is by having the crucial conversation. You understand what I'm saying? So trust can be misapplied in this situation, and it can, wrongly used, it can become a barrier to a crucial conversation. So there's some of the barriers. You might be able to think, or you no doubt can think of some others, but those are the ones that I just wanted to talk briefly about this afternoon. Let's get on to the issue of the types of crucial conversations. This is really quite important here in terms of understanding these. So the first is what I call personal conversations. Now, this is a conversation between you and another person. It could be a relational issue between you and that person. There might be a need for, and we'll come to this again in a moment, restoration. We'll talk more about that. But it's a personal situation. And so there needs to be a conversation had in order to get that relationship functioning again. It could even be as simple as this. It doesn't have to be a negative all the time, folks. A crucial conversation that is personal could be just something as simple as, I just want to get to know the person better. We don't really know each other. We work side by side. We've been here for X amount of years, but I don't really know that person. And it could be just as simple as having a cup of coffee with them or a meal and getting to know that person better. So crucial conversations fall into that category of what I call personal conversations. Can I talk about that too? On the one of getting to know people, I was saying this to our church on Sunday on a different topic, but the whole concept of relationships around a meal or around a cup of coffee, did you know that they're sacred spaces? They are sacred spaces. For example, in the ministry of Jesus, look at the holy and sacred things that often happen around the meal table. Zacchaeus gets right with God around the meal table. Jesus institutes communion, central to our faith as Christians, around a meal table. When Peter is restored to ministry, where does it happen? On a beach. And as I said on Sunday, quoting another minister, Jesus is poking around in a fry pan, cooking fish and getting a meal prepared. It's such a wonderfully human and yet such a wonderfully godlike thing, isn't it? And good things happen. So relationships can be built, personal and strong relationships can be built around in that sacred space. The next type of conversation is restoration. These are where the relationship is broken down and there needs to be a conversation between the two people. I had this experience just recently. This involved a former leader in our church, and it was related to a couple of other people in paid ministry in our church, and there was a lot of complaining going on and a lot of undermining and a lot of personal attack on me. And so what happens is you get these people operating in that space, and this particular lay leader left the church angrily. When he went, I responded, I gave him a blessing. Of course, I wasn't happy. I had my own issues and stuff like that, but I did not send him off angrily. I wanted to bless him. I sent him off with a blessing. Some months later, I received a text from him, and he said, "Can we meet?" And so I texted back and said, what was the purpose? I was intending to meet with him, but I wanted to know the purpose of it. And he came back and he said, for the purpose of reconciling. And so we sat down, and we actually did this with a person that we agreed upon, and we sat down, and in that restoration, this wasn't the way sometimes we do it as Christians, where it's, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm sorry too, let's all hug and be fine. There were things, a number of things I had to put on the table. And I said to him, and so I just went through them one by one, and to his great credit, He listened, he owned it, he apologised. I asked him, is there anything that you need to tell me? There were a couple of things he needed to tell me, which I owned. I apologised for. And we were reconciled. Now that whole process probably took 30 minutes to an hour, but folks, they're crucial. They're crucial conversations. And so I was at an event recently where he had been invited to as well. And you know, here's the beauty of it. As difficult as it is and all the stuff, all the water that went under the bridge, but I'm free to go up to him at that and shake his hand and say hello, and we just had this free-flowing conversation. Why? Because we just followed some simple principles. I'm just saying to you, don't avoid these conversations. I want to highlight to you the importance of them. And then there is another crucial conversation, which is feedback. We won't talk a lot about this, but this falls into the area of where you're working with colleagues and perhaps you're a supervisor or you have responsibility and you have to provide that person with feedback. That's a crucial conversation. You have to have that conversation. And that's something that I've had to learn over my years of ministry, that from time to time you have to sit down with your colleagues, and if you're in authority over them, you have to have, sometimes it's going to be a difficult one. You want to obviously encourage, and we all do that, I hope. But sometimes there are some areas that you have to get into to say, look, you're not performing in this area, or whatever the language is, or what happened here. Now, we struggle with that in Christian ministry. Whether it's in schools or in churches, we struggle with that because we all think we're all Christians, and as one of my young leaders says, we just love on each other. He was being sarcastic. He was quoting a book that he was reading that said, you know, and again, the book was a humorous book, but it was saying, oh, it must be wonderful to work in a Christian organisation, or in the church, because everybody just loves on everybody. Nobody worries about getting things done or doing this or doing that. We just love on each other. And you know why we laugh? Because it's true. There is the tendency for us to do that. Should we love on each other? Of course we should. But love also includes at times having to tell people the truth, and we're going to talk about that in a moment's time. So I can remember a situation, this was another guy, this is going back 3 years ago now, and we were in a staff meeting, and he just lost it in terms of an idea that I put up, and he bang, 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 and making all these accusations and da-da-da-da-da-da. Now he knew, he had the self-awareness to know that he overstepped his boundary. And so I've gone back into my office and I'm still trying to recover from this. And he comes in and he says, are we all right? I'm thinking, can I say this here? I'm thinking, like hell we are. That's what I'm thinking. No, we're not all right. And I forget how I had to word it in such a way that I wasn't dishonest, but so I forget exactly what I said. I didn't lie to him, but I didn't affirm him, because if I had affirmed him at that moment and said everything's fine, nothing is going to change and nothing's going to get dealt with. I needed to go away and process what had happened and then give him feedback, which is exactly what I did. I was supposed to be going on actually a personal retreat that afternoon. It completely ruined the retreat because I spent the whole afternoon. But what I did was I sat down and I just went bang, 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 bang through, listed it all, truthfully but lovingly, and then a week later sat down with him and worked him through it. And to his credit, he took that and he went away and started to work on it. That's to his credit. And then he came back to me. And again, this is to his credit, because he came back to me a week later after he'd been thinking and praying about it, and we'd given him some time off just to work through some stuff. He came back and he said, I was really angry when I left your office the other day. You know what? That's okay for him to say that. It was confronting for him. But then he talked about how he thought it through. And the interesting thing was, in that relationship, sometime later, I was asked to be a referee for him for another role that he was seeking. And I had to explain that we'd gone through this process, and I was trying to explain where he was up to, because he was really trying to make some headway. But the leader of the Christian organisation that was talking to me said, and I'm not telling you this to make myself look good. What I'm telling you this is because this is so often true. He said, not many people would do that. And folks, that's the reality. Because my point before, we think in Christian ministry we should avoid these conversations, but we can't afford to, because The person is at stake for a start. There are other people that are working with that person and the organisation. I mean, shouldn't we be doing this better than the world? We're talking about God's church, the kingdom of God, all of these things. So having these conversations are important. So that's just some of the types of crucial conversations. So let's get to the nuts and bolts. How to have a crucial conversation. And I'm going to refer you here to Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through to 17. You can see that there on the screen. Now, this is the well-known passage where Jesus taught. The word that we've used in the past is the word discipline. But really, this is about a crucial conversation. And in this particular instance, Jesus is talking about a brother who's caught in a particular sin or a problem. So a crucial conversation needs to be had. And so Jesus gives us the steps on how to go about that. I'll comment on a couple of the specifics of it in a moment. But notice in verse 15 that the first step when you're going to have a crucial conversation is keep it personal and keep it private. Do you notice what Jesus says? If you become aware of the situation, whatever it might be, go to the person in private. Okay? Really important. Now, you might be saying, well, okay, we're talking here about a sin issue. But I would also add to this, jot down Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 and 24. That's the issue of a relationship breakdown. So this is about, remember when Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, the person is going to the altar to worship, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. What does he say? Forget about worship and go and put the relationship right. A crucial conversation needs to be had. So whether the crucial conversation revolves around a behavioural issue or whether it's a relational issue, I'm saying to you that the principle is go to the person in private. And I want to underline again why it's so crucial, because look at the context of Matthew chapter 18. In the first 5 or 6 verses, Matthew 18 begins with the disciples ask Jesus the question, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Remember what Jesus did? He called the child over and talked about humility. And then he says, this is the thing that we go, isn't that sweet? Jesus loves kids, and it's all true. But we miss the next part where Jesus goes on and talks about, I tell you that anyone who causes one of these little ones to stumble, it's better for a millstone to be put around his neck. And then he goes on and talks about the problem of stumbling blocks and the little ones. I believe the little ones that Jesus is referring to are those people in the kingdom of God that have a simple, humble, childlike faith. And they see some of the relational garbage that goes on in the church and it causes them to stumble. Does it ring any bells for you? It's happened way too often. And so Jesus is saying, listen, how you handle this stuff is really important. It's crucial. Because it actually causes problems for other people. And then he goes on and he talks about the shepherd seeking out, he leaves 99 behind and goes and seeks the lost sheep. And again, it's in the context of the little ones. Then he comes and he says, this is how you do it. This is how you deal with this stuff. This is how you don't become a millstone around a person's neck and cause them to stumble. And then, not surprisingly, it's followed by the parable of forgiveness. Remember that great parable on forgiveness? Peter says, how often should I forgive my brother? And he says, 7 times. He thinks it's been pretty good because the Pharisees said, well, if you forgive someone 3 times, that's enough, but the 4th time, sorry, thanks for playing, you're out of here. So Peter thinks, well, Jesus is a pretty good guy, so maybe Jesus would do more than double, so maybe 7 times is how often I should forgive the person. And Jesus says, what? 70 times 7. And he does not mean that when that number is exceeded, that you cancel the person. He's saying forgiveness is unlimited. And it all follows on this context here of how to deal with people who are caught in sin or relational difficulties, that type of thing. Forgiveness becomes important in the process. So he says, go to the person personally and go privately. And he says, if your brother listens to you, great, you've won your brother. It's a good result. So how do we do this? Let me give you some examples. Straight out of ministry experience. I'm going back now 30 plus years, second church Karen and I were in, we noticed we had a married couple in our church. Husband was away a lot with his work, so he was often away 6 weeks at a time. Young couple, another young guy in the church. At the time, he'd broken up with his girlfriend. Karen and I observed that this married lady, husband was away, and this young guy was spending increasing amounts of time together, including, travelling together, this sort of thing. Other people were noticing it but not saying anything. Now, do you think a crucial conversation needs to be had? Absolutely. So Karen and I sat down, we talked about it. From memory, we got some advice from some older Christians or people in ministry, and we agreed to, in this case, that Karen would talk with the wife, I would talk with the young guy. And so in my conversation, same with Karen's, we agreed what we'd say, but I just laid it out. But I went about it this way, made no accusations. I made it very clear in this conversation, I'm not accusing you of anything, but I have noticed this. And, what's happening? He gave me an assurance that nothing was happening. Then I explained to him, I said, well, mate, you need to stop this because it could lead somewhere. Again, I'm not making any accusations, but you need to stop this and you need to break off the relationship. Karen had a similar conversation with the lady. Sadly, they did not heed that advice, and it ended up where it shouldn't have ended up. It got really messy. But what I'm saying is so these things don't always work out 100%, but it shouldn't stop you from having the conversation. Follow my drift? And if it doesn't work out, it's not your fault. And if the person blows up and gets angry or says that you're accusing me of all sorts of stuff, it doesn't mean you've done it wrong. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have had the conversation. Sometimes you have to be prepared for that. I can think of another one where, and in this case, it took probably 12 months for this to get sorted out, but the second day that I was in the church at Thornley, and it's quite okay to talk about this because it was fairly well known, certainly in the church and out in the public, but second day on the job, we're having a welcome picnic for Karen and I, and Karen comes to me, she says, I think your associate pastor is having an affair with that lady. Welcome to the church, but this is my second day on the job. So, and my wife is pretty discerning. Anyway, as it panned out, probably a month or so later, one of my work colleagues came to me. Now, this was handled correctly. He began to observe some things, and he was concerned. He was a little bit closer to the situation. So he did the right thing. You might say, well, should he have gone to that person privately? I think in this case, it was a work colleague. He came to me for some advice. He made no accusations. He didn't talk to anybody else about it. He said, what are we going to do? And I said, you and I will go and sit down and have a conversation with him. And it went along the lines of, we've noticed and we are concerned. Is there anything going on? He denied it all. And so we explained, well, look, you need to be careful, particularly in ministry, people talk, you have that kind of conversation. Again, sadly, that one did not turn out. It turned out to be true, but it took 12 months for it to come out. But what I'm saying is it was private and personal. We did not go to a bunch of people and say, can you pray about this? Or can you give me some advice on this? We didn't do that. We went to the person concerned. And I just want to reiterate to you the importance of this, because you're holding a person's soul in your hand with this stuff. And if it's not handled properly, the damage that can be done. Even if what you suspect is true, you can do a lot of damage by talking to the wrong people. So my encouragement to you is keep your mouth shut. Don't spread it around. I'm thinking of a couple of work colleagues that I had, and where I had to have some conversations with them. Again, good, respectful conversations. I don't tell anybody else about that. So I might have it with person X here. I don't tell anybody else in the office about that. And then I had to have a conversation with person Z over here. I don't tell anybody in the office about that. But then what I discover is they've gone and talked to each other and had a big whinge session, and then they've involved another staff member and another leader in the church. Folks, that's not how this goes. So if you're the person that has been approached about the conversation, you have a responsibility to keep your mouth shut too. Because I'll tell you this much, But if you go blabbing your mouth and you give just one side of the story, you know what happens? Mud sticks. And that's the damage that happens. Mud sticks. And no matter what the other person might say, if they're called upon to defend themselves, it sticks. So I cannot emphasise the importance of privacy and keeping your mouth shut. It is very important. As I said, don't put the person on your prayer list, and don't go seeking. In the case of these two guys I'm thinking of, they were just looking for confirmation that they were okay. And that's what they were complaining about me. So they can say, oh, so he raised that with you, and you know how it goes. That's not the way to handle these situations. Here's the second thing that Jesus mentions. He tells us when to seek mediation. So, what if the situation is not resolved, whether it's a relational issue or whether it's a sin issue? In Jewish law, it was a requirement that a person who was on trial would not be condemned on the basis of one witness. You needed to have more than one witness. And so that's what Jesus is appealing to here. He's appealing to Jewish law. You could not condemn someone solely on the testimony of one witness. But the other thing that comes out of this is that by having witnesses, plural, they can actually determine the facts of the situation, and they can also provide some mediation in the situation. And that's what Jesus is referring to here. I remember years ago reading John White, a Christian psychologist. He had some great things to say about the value of witnesses. If you need someone else to come in and act as a mediator, or a couple of people act as a mediator in this situation, the value of the witnesses is it brings a new seriousness to the situation. So maybe the person has just been a bit glib about this. Oh, it's nothing. Well, when you bring in a couple of people to mediate and try and get this resolved, it actually tells everybody involved in the situation, this is serious and we want to get this sorted out. The other value of having the witnesses is that you bring in additional wisdom. So you get the right people, they can come in and they might be able to actually point out where maybe you need to learn some things as well. We need to be open to that. And they bring additional wisdom, and they might be able to bring reconciliation. The other value is objectivity. And so they might be able to determine where the fault lies, but they come from it in an objective way. And then finally, there is also affirmation. In other words, the witnesses actually hear who said what. Okay, that's the value of it. And that was the value with my friend and I when we had this reconciliation process 3 months ago, is that by having another person that we both respected there, he was able to affirm the things that we said. Do you understand what I'm saying? He can affirm what was said and who said what and how it was said. He was there. And so you get away from this business of he did this and he did that when you have a witness in that situation. Verse 17 then goes on, and it talks more specifically, and you can read that for yourself, about if that fails, the idea of taking to the church, that becomes a whole much more serious situation. But let me encourage you with the words of Paul in Galatians 6:1. Do you remember what he said? You who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of humility. You know what the word restore means? It actually means to fix up the holes in the fisherman's net. So you look at the net and you restore it, you fix up the holes. And so the person who is caught in sin or some relational difficulty, when you restore them, it's like you're mending the net, you're putting it back together. The other meaning behind the word restore is to put a broken bone back into place. Isn't that great? Because we're all broken. Sometimes we just need somebody, it's painful at the time, but sometimes we need somebody to reset the bone. And it must be done in a spirit of humility. We're going for time. Just want to leave some time for questions. So here's some practical advice for crucial conversations in terms of a little bit more on how to go about having these conversations. So let's say you want to have a conversation, you want to sort out a relational issue with a person. Bearing in mind I'm coming from my family of origin, I told you that my tendency is to avoid conflict. But I'm thankful that I've been a Christian for a long time and been exposed to God's word. And so the challenge for me is, despite those issues, wrestling with the conviction of God's word and how I should go about these. And so seeking very imperfectly to put these into practice, but also learning along the way. And it's a lifelong journey. And I'm still learning on this. I want you to know that, because I still make mistakes in these situations. But I can truthfully say I'm learning from those mistakes. Okay, when I've mucked it up or not got it right, I can go away and I can say, okay, next time I need to remember. You know what I mean? That's how we learn from this. But hopefully we get more skillful at doing it as well. So here's the first step if you're going to approach someone in a crucial conversation. Pray about it. That's where we should start. Now, what am I saying about praying? Well, one of the things you can pray is this conversation needed? I had a classic with a senior pastor that I worked with years ago, great guy. But there was some stuff that he did that annoyed me. Do you have people who annoy you? There's some stuff that he did and said at times that just annoyed me. And I'm sitting there because I've had it drummed into me that, if you've got something against your brother, you've got to go and talk about it. I'm thinking, I just wasn't comfortable with it. And I'm praying through this. And I came across Proverbs. And I can't give you the chapter reference, but this is what it said. Love covers a multitude of sins. You know what God was saying to me? The problem is not your senior pastor, the problem is you. This is your problem. You need to deal with it. You need to show a bit more grace and a bit more love. Oh, that was a revelation. Sometimes that's all it takes. That's why I say pray about it. See what God is saying to you. The other reason that I say to pray, what else you can pray about, is that it helps you process your anger. So I've mentioned a couple of colleagues that I'd worked with. I'm telling you, in my praying, because I'm wrestling with all of the forgiveness issue and loving your enemies and all of that, but there was a lot of anger expressed in that. And there had to be. There had to be. I'm pouring out my heart to God. But you see, that it's better to do that with God and have Him deal with you than to vomit all over the person in the situation, don't you think? So prayer will help you process your anger. But the other prayer that you pray is if you've concluded you're going to have this conversation. This is how I pray. I've been doing this for years. God, prepare my heart for this conversation and prepare Joe's heart for this conversation. I found that enormous. It's a simple prayer, but it's enormously beneficial. Prepare my heart, prepare their heart. So, for example, when I went into that situation with my friend where we were reconciling, and I had some issues there that needed to be put on the table, but my prayer going into that to prepare myself was to say to God, don't let me take the moral high ground. I had some legitimate grievances, but I said to God, and I meant this, don't let me take the moral high ground and come across like I'm right and you're wrong, and keep me humble. And that's what happened. We both listened to each other and were reconciled. So pray. The next one is to plan. And what I mean by this is plan the right time. I would, for example, going back to that situation I gave of the staff worker who asks me after the staff meeting, are we okay, and all this sort of stuff. That wasn't the right time to ask. That's dropped on me, and we can drop this. So a crucial conversation should not be dropped on someone when they are not expecting it. You need to plan the right time, at a time that is suitable for both of you, a time where you can both sit down and just talk things through. So planning the right time. And also, that includes where it's to be held. Okay? It might be best to have it in a neutral territory. So planning is really important. Prepare is the next step. Let me just give you some practical statements. So I rehearse these things. So I've given you some examples of conversations I've had to have with people. But I prepared, I go over this in my head. So, for example, when it was confronting some of those people with pretty big sin issues, I made sure I would go in and I would sit down and I would just talk in terms of, say, look, I've got something difficult to talk with you about. I don't want to make any assumptions. I'm not accusing you of anything. So you try to take the sting out of it as much as possible. But what if it's just a relational issue, or you and the other person are not connecting and you're really wondering what's going on? Here's a great sentence to ask. Can I check an assumption I have? Can I just check something with you? And you're using the words, can I check an assumption with you? Can you imagine how many relationships could be repaired and be better just by asking that question? It's a simple question, isn't it? What I'm trying to do is give you some language here. And these questions I owe to Peter and Jerry Scazzero. They've got some wonderful stuff about this in their book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And then when the person gives permission, can I check an assumption I have? I like that better, because sometimes they say, can I have permission to read your mind? I kind of feel like you come across as a weirdo when you say that, but maybe that's just me. But when the person gives you permission, yes, you can check your assumption. Then you say something like, I think that you think, or I'm wondering. That's a great question, isn't it? I'm wondering. Is it correct? Having the right language. You might say, oh, this is all artificial. I can tell you now, I rehearse these sorts of things or similar questions in my head going into it so that I've got an idea of where the conversation will go and how it will go. And it's so important when you're setting it, setting the bar at the beginning of the conversation. The next step is speak the truth in love. So now you're getting down to the nitty-gritty. You want to be truthful. You don't want to beat around the bush. This is a great one. I've noticed. And you just simply state what it is. But do you see, you're not accusing the person. You're not coming and saying, you did this or you did that. I've noticed. Let me give you an example early in our marriage. This will tell you a lot more about me than it does about Karen. You'll think Karen is a saint after I tell you this story. But probably in the first week after our honeymoon, we'd moved into our flat, and I noticed that when she ironed my shirts, she put them in the old way on my coat hanger. Some would face this way, some would face that way. And I tell you, this tells you more about her than it does before. It tells a lot about me. And I thought, because I just like to go to the cupboard, this is really bad. And the shirt is facing the right way, and I pull it out and it's ready to go. That's me. Okay? Would it surprise you to tell you that I struggle a bit with OCD? Probably not. And I thought, how do I have this conversation? Well, we were both 20 when we were married, and bearing in mind the families that we came from, how do I go about this? So I just simply said to her, I sat down and I said, you're probably going to think this is really crazy, probably think that I'm whatever, but this is how I like my shirts done. And she's never done them the way I like it since. No, that's not true. No, do you know what? She said, okay, that's fine with me. It was a simple conversation. Do you know marriages rise and fall on that stuff? I know of, the big one that's often in marriages is about, women love to have the toilet seat kept down, which is true. I can tell you the story of a married couple who, after 20 years of frustration with that, because the wife had never spoken up about it, the son was telling me they nearly divorced over that. All the tension and the stuff that came out. Fancy divorcing over a dunny seat, but anyway. So I've noticed it's the language that we use. We have to be non-accusatory. Speaking the truth in love and finding ways to do it. Look, another example, I can remember a guy, this guy was particularly arrogant. He had hit his wife over the head with a telephone. Okay, this is back in the days when you had telephones. And he'd given me this excuse of, I never did that. He said, I was swinging the telephone around by the cord, as you do in a conversation with your wife. This is a true story. And he said, somehow, you hit her in the head. So I said, I won't tell you what I was thinking of saying. I know what I wanted to say, because this bloke was volatile, so you've got to bear that in mind as well. But I said to him, I spoke the truth in love, but I did it as graciously as I could. And I said, do you really think, it was words to this effect, do you really think that that is the way in which a Christian man behaves? It was interesting, he jumped out of the seat. I thought he was going to deck me. So I'm glad I actually toned it down. But do you see what I'm saying? Speaking the truth, you've got to speak the truth, but you can do it in loving ways. But don't confuse love with truth. Don't think that the loving thing is just to gloss over it. You have to speak the truth. And people need to hear it, but we can do it in loving ways. Which brings me to the next point. Keep calm. So when it comes to, I've noticed, whatever it is the problem is, actually state what you want, but do it lovingly. I would prefer, but don't do it in an angry way. Don't make an accusation. Don't say, I want this, or demand. I've noticed this, I would prefer. These are simple skills that we can all learn. And with practice, it becomes a whole lot easier, and you will find your own language for these things as well. So keeping calm is important. And allow for reaction time. Give the person that you're talking to time to react. Give them the grace to respond. This is new to them. So give them the time to respond and allow for reaction time. I can think of a significant moment in my relationship with Karen. There was a particular thing that had happened to her as a young girl at the age of 15 that she did not want. Incredibly damaging. It was something she didn't talk about. Well, at this stage, I had known her for almost 20 years. And it was one of those subjects, whenever it came up in conversation with other people, not about her specifically, but a similar issue, she would just freeze up. And I was sitting in my office one particular day listening to a tape about this particular subject, and this is Karen. And those God moments when God says, you've got to go and talk to her about this. This has been a no-go zone. Not that she did it, we danced around it. And I was doing that because I thought, well, I'm showing love to her. I went home and I said to her, I've just come home with this tape, back in the days of tapes, and I want you to have a listen to this. And I'll come back at lunchtime, we'll talk. So I'm not trying to say anything, could you just listen to it? It spoke to me, and I just feel I need to let you listen to it. And so I went back to the office, came back at lunchtime. She was a mess. But I'd given her the space to listen and to react and to process and begin the process of healing. So you've got to give people space, allow them reaction time, so important. And then finally, commit. Can we agree to this? Whatever the solution is, can we agree to this? And part of that is, can we pray? Let's pray together. So some simple steps there. Now just 2 other practical ideas and then I'm done, and this was real quick. We can all improve our conversations. This is called the community temperature reading. Got this from Peter and Jerry Scazzaro, and I think this is wonderful. This is something that you can do with another person, with a colleague. You can do it with your family around the dinner table. You can do it with your husband or your wife or friend. You can do it in team meetings. You can have it at the start of a team meeting. This is just a way to go around the table and just talk about stuff. And you might say, I don't like the language. Well, find your own language. But what I discover, and Karen and I have talked about this in our counselling of couples, in premarital counselling, is because a lot of people don't talk. And it's getting worse with phones and, we all know the problem. But this is how we can improve our conversation. So you just go around the table. You might not cover everything, but you just go around and you say, okay, has anybody got any appreciations or excitements? Well, what, are you excited about something, or is there something that you appreciate about someone else or that they did? And then you can turn to worries or concerns or puzzles. I'm worried that, or I'm puzzled by. You just keep it light. This is not in-depth sharing, but it just gets you starting to talk. Then you have complaints and possible solutions. I notice that you hang my shirts up wrong. I would prefer, well, not I would say that. I notice you don't hang my shirts the way I would like. I would prefer. See what I'm saying? You offer solution. New information. My new information is, hey, I've booked us in for a 2-week holiday in Jamaica or something like that. Oh, that'd be great. That'd go over well. And then you talk about hopes and wishes. I'm hoping that Christmas dinner will be fantastic, or I wish that we could get a bit more time together in our busy schedules, or whatever it might be. I'm saying these are available. We've got about 20 copies, and it's going to be sent out to you. But you could do this with someone over coffee, you could do it with your husband or wife, you might want to introduce it into your team meetings or whatever. But this is such an effective tool, it's such a simple tool, and it just helps build relationships and strengthens them and gets people talking at a level that sometimes they don't get anywhere near. The other one is, I want to throw this out as an idea, because you are a community of people. I don't know if you've ever heard of the thing called dinners of 8, but that's basically where you get 8 people who don't really know each other and they have dinner. And we've done that in our church, or in every church we've been in bar one. And it's a great idea. You just get people to sign up. Some people say they're going to be a host, and what the idea is, you get 8 people together, meet at another person's home, and you'll bring parts of the meal and stuff like that. And the names will go into a hat, you have the hosts, and then people are just assigned. And you do your very best to assign people away from their normal group. And the feedback, every time we've done that, the feedback we have had, it just is such a great way of breaking down barriers and building relationships. As I said before, good things happen around the meal table. So, Darnell, if you want to know more about that, I'm happy to give you some more details, but that might be an idea. I'm done. If you would like to talk at any point, there's my email. You can drop me an email. I'm happy to hang around and talk. I don't know, is it time for some questions, or I'll hand over to you?
Thank you so much, Rob. It's been a real joy, and we love having you here. Thank you very much. If you'd like to ask some questions or have a conversation, please feel free to come down and have a chat afterwards. I'm just cognizant of the fact that many might need to leave right now. But could you join me again and say thank you to Rob for this information? I hope that it's been helpful. There are things there that many of us work in every day, and then there are things that are there that are brand new. So take it on board. We now have a common language if we need to have conversations, and good luck. Have a lovely afternoon, and thanks so much. God bless.